Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So today, inshallah, we're going to continue our 17th hadith. So we're going to do our 17th hadith from Al-Arba'in Nawawiyya. And last week I wasn't able to do it, so inshallah today we'll actually do it. There's a number of different things that we need to talk about in this hadith, so stay tuned because there are a number of different issues that we need to talk about. And the most importantly, al-ihsan, and number two, which is when we're talking about the limit. What is the limit of something good or something evil? So we're talking about the limits. No matter what you do, there's always going to be a limit to something, and there's always more to do of good. What is that? The other part is, yes, we're going to go in some detail about the Zabiha. This is a very common question, the issue of the Zabiha, and what if I forget to do the tasmiyah on the Zabiha? What does it do, and what does it mean? And the issue of having different opinions sometimes can actually lead to a confusion. So we're going to talk about a number of different things, inshallah. And I'm going to start with reading the hadith. I'm going to start with reading the hadith, and the hadith goes as follows. عن أبي يعلى شداد بن أوس رضي الله تعالى عنه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله كتب الإحسان على كل شيء فإذا قتلتم فأحسنوا القتلة وإذا ذبحتم فأحسنوا الذبح وليحد أحدكم شفرته وليرح ذبيحته رواه مسلم. So I'll read the hadith again. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الله كتب الإحسان على كل شيء فإذا قتلتم فأحسنوا القتلة وإذا ذبحتم فأحسنوا الذبح وليحد أحدكم شفرته وَلْيُرِحْ ذَبِيحَتَهُ. I'm going to first translate the hadith, the literal form of it, and then we'll go deeper into what the scholars have derived rulings from that. So, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَتَبَ الْإِحْسَانَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, I'm going to use the word kataba to mean prescribed for now, but then I'm going to go in detail with that word. Prescribed al-ihsan. Al-ihsan means piety, means good relations, kindness on everything. فَإِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَةَ. When you kill something, then do it in the least harm. And if you do the biha, which is slaughtering something to eat, then فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَ, then do the least harm in the slaughter. وَلْيُحِدَّ أَحَدُكُمْ شَفْرَتَهُ, and let the person that is shafra, which is the razor, whatever they're killing with, which is the slaughtering with, the knife. Yuhidda means sharpen it. وَلْيُرِحْ ذَبِيحَتَهُ, and rest the dhabiha that they are slaughtering to eat, of course. Rawahu Muslim. Now you could see here there's a number, pretty straightforward. The hadith is really short in the wordings, but there are actually a number of things to it. So I'm going to start with Abi Ya'la Shaddad ibn Aus. I'm going to talk about Abu Ya'la. Then we're going to talk about what does it mean, kataba, does this mean it's obligatory? We're going to talk about al-ihsan. I'm going to talk about why does it make a difference between al-qitla, or slaughter, killing, and slaughter, and we're going to go in some details about that. So in the hadith, of course, we know that in Islam, when we're talking about dhabiha, there's a difference between killing something that is harmful and dhabiha, which is something that we use to eat. But before that, I'm going to start with Abi Ya'la Shaddad ibn Aus. Now, Shaddad ibn Aus has a very personal relationship with me, I must admit. You might say, okay, well, wait a minute. What's going on? So Shaddad ibn Aus was actually buried in Al-Quds. Shaddad ibn Aus, in fact, I visited his grave a number of times. It's right on Bab al-Asbat, which is Lion's Gate right now. And it is right on the door and the main entrance of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And my grandfather is actually buried really close to him. So Ubadah ibn Samit, Ubadah ibn Samit and Shaddad ibn Aus are both actually buried right next to each other. And Shaddad ibn Aus was actually the nephew, Hassan ibn Thabit's nephew. And Shaddad ibn Aus, there was a narration that Shaddad ibn Aus was with the Prophet ﷺ. And he was actually feeling like sorrow. He wasn't feeling so good, and the Prophet ﷺ just said, "Malaka ya Shaddad, like what's wrong with you?" He said, "Qala ضاقت بي الدنيا." He said, "I feel like the whole world just collapsed and closed up on me." And the Prophet ﷺ said, don't worry about it, because Bilad al-Sham, all the Levant, is going to be ruled by Muslims, and so is Bayt al-Maqdis, so is Al-Quds. And in fact, the Prophet ﷺ tells him, وَتَكُونُ أَنْتَ وَوَلَدُكَ مِنْ بَعْدِكَ أَئِمَّةٌ فِيهَا, and you and your son will be leaders in it. And it was said, the narrator said, and later he actually had went to Bayt al-Maqdis, went to Al-Quds, which is one part of the time I lived in Bayt al-Maqdis, and it was a special moment in my life. And later he actually went to Bayt al-Maqdis, he actually went to Bilad al-Sham, the Levant, and even lived in Bayt al-Maqdis, or lived in Al-Quds, which is what today is called Jerusalem, and even died there. And he died in 58-year Hijrah, when he was 95 years old. This is Shaddad ibn Aus, and of course Ubadah ibn Samit was buried right next to him. I wish I had a picture, but you can actually find the picture of his grave. I have it in my photos, but I guess I didn't have the time to look for it. To make the story short, Ubadah ibn Samit actually narrated about 50 hadith, and Ubadah ibn Samit was one of those leaders that was known for being very eloquent in his speech, and that he was very calm during anger, something that we all have to work on. It's really easy to get angry and start your anger, letting it vibrate and letting it go outside of you, but it's so hard to hold in and just be patient and imprison your anger inside your body. So right now, let's go on with the hadith. So, number of things to say about the hadith. Number one is that the hadith actually says, "Inna Allah kataba al-ihsana ala kulli shay." That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had, the word is kataba. So kataba actually has two meanings. The word kataba would mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated. And that's why in the Quran you will see the word kataba frequently in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says in the Quran, for example, كتب عليكم القتال, or يا أيها الذين آمنوا كتب عليكم الصيام, or might say ولقد كتبنا في الزبور من بعد الذكر من بعد أن الأرض يرثها عبادي الصالحون. So when we look at the word kataba, or inna Allah kataba al-ihsan, just like in this hadith, when we see the word kataba, there are actually a number of meanings for the word kataba. The first one would mean an obligation. So that would mean al-kitaba would mean an obligation, meaning obligatory. And whenever we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribed, it actually means ordained. It actually means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated, made this as an obligation, made this as a prescription that every Muslim must abide with. So here when we look at katab al-ihsan, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated that the Muslims would act in ihsan. What is the word ihsan? So ihsan, actually the literal word for ihsan actually comes from the root hasana, which means to perfect. It also includes kindness. And when we say katab al-ihsan, so the question is, what perfection? What ihsan? Now, it's really important to mention, let me just use this annotate for a bit. Just give me a second. when we say al-ihsan, so there is al-ihsan and there is the other level, which is actually al-adala. What is the difference? So when we say al-ihsan, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inna Allah ya'muru bil-adli wal-ihsan. I want you to look at this one. Bil-adli wal-ihsan. وينهى عن المنكر والفحشاء والبغي. Now right here, that al-adl, or the limit, is actually al-adl, in where you're acting with justice. You're acting with the limit. There's a certain limit. But al-ihsan is to give beyond. Let's give an example. When we're talking about dealing, let's say, with your brother and sister, there's the level of adl. There's, you take a share, I take the exact same share. That we are here at a level of equity. But al-ihsan is actually higher than that, because you're not dealing based on the principle of justice only, but you're dealing based on the principle of goodness. You're dealing based on the principle of sharing. You're dealing based on the principle of giving in. So this is when we're looking at ihsan. There's the principle of giving in. There's the principle of sharing. There's the principle of you're preferring the other person above you, and that would be al-ihsan. So al-adl, where yes, you get this share and I get this share, we're both on the equal level. Now, when we talk about parents, it's really important that when we're dealing with people around us, generally we're dealing with adl. Generally we're dealing with justice. But when we're dealing with ihsan, that's a higher level to give in, because then I'm not looking at me as a center, meaning myself as a center, but I'm looking at the other people as the center. I'm giving in and considering them as prior and even above my needs. So this is al-ihsan. Now, when we're looking at that, it's really important to consider that when dealing with parents, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered that we deal not with al-adl, but with al-ihsan. What does that mean? I want you to look at this, because generally speaking, the first level that you don't want to cross is al-adl. But when it comes to dealing with parents, no, al-ihsan is the default. Al-adl with your parents, that would actually mean you're going less than the prescribed level. Al-ihsan is supposed to be the level that you should be on in dealing with your parents, not the issue of adl, not the issue of fairness. And that's why, for example, it's really important that you teach your children that they should not tell you things, for example, to tell you, Mom, you're not being fair here, because with the parent, there's a level of ihsan. When you're talking to probably your sibling, you can say and talk about justice, but when it comes to your parents, you're dealing and you're using the standard, and the highest paradigm to work with is actually ihsan and not justice. Justice is that with parents, you're supposed to go beyond. Now, let's keep going with here. Inna Allah kataba al-ihsan. When we talk about ihsan, we're actually talking about different kinds of ihsan. There's an ihsan that is wajib, and there's an ihsan that is, let's call it, the sunnah or the mustahab level. What does that mean? So there's an ihsan that you have to be at that level, which is the ihsan al-wajib, which is to the parents. All right? But there's that extra that you do, just like when you deal probably with your friends, maybe you give a sadaqah. That's an extra thing that you do. All right? That's an extra thing that you do. But generally speaking, when we're talking about ihsan, we're actually talking about one. Al-ihsan, we're also talking about it from a different angle. In where we're talking about ihsan wajib, we're talking about, the limit is you have to actually perform this. This is part, and you have to you have to perfect that particular obligation. For example, do the obligatory prayers. You have to perfect it. You have to do every single pillar of it right, every single obligation within your salah right. But then there's that ihsan mustahab. There's that, yes, salah is obligatory, but if you were to add more onto, probably you're making more khushu', you're probably making more dhikr, you're probably making tasbih after salah, you're probably making istighfar after salah. Now that would be ihsan mustahab. That would be, so there's a difference between ihsan wajib and ihsan mustahab. But ihsan in general is actually very important to practice, and the better and the higher level you perfect in, and the more perfection you do it in, the better it is. But here's one thing, is that when we talk about al-ihsan ala kulli shay, in everything, what does it mean to perfect, or at least go to the level of ihsan in everything? So there are actually different levels. Number one is that there's the ihsan that you actually do in your obligations, obligatory prayers, the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated you with, which are generally considered within the five daily things, or the arkan al-Islam. Right? So with arkan al-Islam, that you have to perfect those. The other perfection is basically in abstaining from all the different muharramat, all the different things that are haram. But here's the thing, is that when we're talking about the limit, remember when we're talking about limit and ihsan, so al-adl and al-ihsan, remember this is the limit, and al-ihsan is the extra. All right? So here when we're talking about, for example, things that are haram, the limit is, for example, that you don't drink. But al-ihsan is when you even abstain even from the area, or not even hang out with people that drink. All right? So this would be al-ihsan. That would be the perfection. Let's give another example in where another ihsan, in where abstaining from haram things, in where not only are you abstaining from haram actions, but you're even abstaining from the environment. You're even abstaining from what might lead to that haram thing. Let's give another thing in where ihsan can be in. Ihsan in patience. You can have patience, and the limit is, I'm hanging in there, I'm not screaming, I'm not complaining, but al-ihsan in your patience, there's the level, there's the limit, but there's ihsan in patience, in where you're going a higher level and you're content, rather than constantly damning the situation and cursing the situation. You're actually bringing in that positive behavior, that positive perspective of things, rather than constantly complaining about the situation. Now this is al-ihsan. So there's the limit, and then there's al-ihsan. There's also al-ihsan when we're talking about dealing with the people around you. The society that we're living in, it's always trying to complain about how everyone has just, their akhlaq have changed, how everything in the world is just based on greed, based on selfishness, etc., and not realizing that we're constantly requesting that people change, and we barely look at, well, how can I change? People are not going to change based on how you want them to change. You change. And not to mention that, yes, you will not have all these different examples around you, and it is very common that you will barely find any good role models. Right now, we're actually struggling to find a role model. Why don't we change that angle in how we see things and say, you be the role model that you wish to be, that you wish to find? Because whether you're talking about X or Y and Z, and right now, especially in the day and age that we're living in, it is so convenient for every single one of us to go and mock or criticize an imam or a scholar or a talib ilm. Why? Because it makes us feel important. It makes us feel that we're better and we're not as bad as that imam or that scholar who himself or herself are actually striving hard to be better people. It is so easy to criticize, but when you're actually when you're the one that is on the spot, you're going to see that each and every single one of us can actually fall. You know what? My husband always tells me, he's like, الساحة فارغة. Everything right now, the field in da'wah is all open. It's all open. If you feel that there's something missing, that something needs to be done, go ahead and you do it. Don't wait for others to actually do it. If you think that there needs to be better counseling, or there needs to be better programs for the youth, or better programs for the Muslim community, start. Don't wait for somebody. It's so easy to say, this is what we need. You start. If you don't know how to actually put a structure together, well, you can probably maybe, if you are somebody that is able to collect donations to find and hire somebody to do the job, or bring project managers or different people. Now that is al-ihsan. When we're talking about ihsan, we're actually talking about not only you can say, well, this is what's missing, but what is ihsan is that you make what is missing possible. You bring it into an actual work that you are criticizing. So when we're looking at dealing with people, it's really important to remember that part of al-ihsan is that you do what needs to be done. Al-ihsan within the community. Now, the other part of al-ihsan is learning how to deal with the people around you, in where you learn the technique of coping. This is really important. When we're talking about adala, it's so easy to criticize the people around you, and say, well, you know what? Why do they have those bad behaviors? Why are they like this? So easy to criticize and actually talk about justice. This is your limit and this is my limit. It's so easy to do that. But when we're talking about ihsan in dealing with people, we're talking about learning how to compromise. We're talking about learning how to cope with the world around you and the people around you. Don't expect people to change based on what you think is right, but you start. You've got that coping skill. And unfortunately, when we're looking at marital problems, a lot of the marital problems are actually starting from the lack of coping skills and dialogue that we have with one another, in where we would assume that utopian understanding or utopian image of what a good person or what a good marriage would look like. And then whenever these people, what we consider, failed on us, we would right away assume that they're the ones that failed on us, and not that we might need to change ourselves. Anyhow, so when we're looking at al-ihsan al-wajib also in dealing with people, so mu'amalat al-khalq. The other type of ihsan is the ihsan of, within the community. So we're looking at ihsan within the family. We're looking at ihsan within ourselves as individuals, and we're looking at ihsan in the family. We're looking at ihsan within the community. The ihsan within the community, in where it starts first, the priority is actually yourself, the individual, and who you're responsible over. Your priority is your family, your children. Those are your priorities. But then if you have more to do, if you're able to give in some more, probably participate, volunteer, or probably work outside your home, etc., you can, but on a condition that you look for al-adl. You look for the beginning is justice. Are you putting your priorities first. Your priorities is your family, that's al-adl. Your husband is your priority, that's al-adl. Your wife is the priority, that's al-adl. If you have time and if you are capable of doing ihsan and doing extra good in the community, whether it's volunteering in the masjid, whether it's helping out, probably teaching, probably, doing extra work for your friends, the society, etc. Now that is al-ihsan. But here's one thing. You first have to start out with al-adl. And of course, working outside, and the priority, not only for the woman, is it her children and her family, but it is also for the man as well. And where there's the priority, and then if you've got the time to do more, well, that's good. Keep going. And finally, al-ihsan fi qatl ma yajuz. Now, this is the last type of al-ihsan. So the Prophet ﷺ was actually talking about the last thing in life. So the Prophet ﷺ was actually telling us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had prescribed al-ihsan on everything. And even lastly, which is that last category, and which is why he emphasized the last category, which is even if you are to kill something. But the question is, why would the Prophet ﷺ actually say that you have to kill in good? I thought killing generally is haram. So killing, if that thing is harming the people, let's just assume that we have a snake, all right, and this snake is harming us. Now, with a snake, the sunnah, before you go and kill a snake, the sunnah is you don't go and kill a snake right away. If the snake enters your home, the sunnah is to tell the snake to leave Bismillah before you attempt to kill it, because it can be a jinn. So the first thing that you do if you find a snake in your home, you tell the snake, ukhruji Bismillah, leave Bismillah. If it doesn't leave, then that's when it is safe for you to kill it. So when we're looking at killing it, how do I kill a snake or a mouse, for example? How do I kill a snake, a mouse, or anything that is harmful? Am I allowed to kill something that is harmful? So generally speaking, if something is harming you, such as maybe mice, maybe dangerous wild animals, or maybe when we're talking about different creatures, those different creatures, if they are harming, yes, it is permissible for you to kill it, but on a condition that you don't use things like fire to kill these things. So you can use, let's say, mouse traps, or you've got a mouse trap, or I don't know if you want to use a knife to, my daughter was saying use a knife to kill a mouse. I'm not sure I would do that. But generally speaking, that even when you kill, don't torture. That's the most important thing. Don't torture that animal to kill it.
What's gonna happen if it's a jinn, and you kill it?
So, first of all, the jinns in, for example, black dogs and, let's say, snakes, if it's a jinn, so that's why you want to make sure before you go and kill that animal, you would first say, if it's a let's say a snake, we say Bismillah, ukhruji Bismillah, or stuff like that. But you don't want to harm an animal before you even give that, if it's a jinn, to stay away, or a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, or something like that, because yes, it can harm. If it was a jinn, yes, it can harm. And that's why, things like, for example, when we're talking about black dogs, when we're talking about when we're talking about snakes, for example, those can be jinn. So that's why you want to say, Bismillah. What, can they harm you? Yes, they can harm. They can harm if it is a jinn. How do they harm? Are they going to spit in your face? Are they going to kill you? Or I don't know how they can harm you, but this is known in the hadith that they can that they can harm us. How do they harm? Allahu A'lam. Alright, so now when we're talking about إِذَا قَتَلْتُمْ فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَةِ, the whole object is that to remove the harm that is caused by that animal. So the way that you want to do it, فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَةِ. So make sure when you kill it, make sure you don't torture it. Don't torture that animal, even if it is causing harm. وَإِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ, and if you do the Zabiha, then فَأَحْسِنُوا الذِّبْحَ. If you make a Zabiha, what is Zabiha? So the difference between a Zabiha and القتل or القتلة, well, qitla is the actual way of killing, but القتل, so here when it's talking about killing, and this is talking about الذبح. الذبح is different than qatl, because القتل, that killing, is killing of something that is not edible. You're not going to eat it. And the dhabh is for something, Zabiha is basically talking about for, slaughtering an animal and preparing it as a meal. That you're slaughtering that animal to prepare it for food. Now it's really important to mention here, it is right now becoming a trend, especially within the youth, to be vegan, and that to be vegan is considered the merciful way of dealing with nature, etc. That type of ideology, philosophy, whatever you want to call it, of looking at the world around us is actually a very dangerous idea, because if you are to say that Zabiha, or that eating animals, is actually against nature, or is brutal in any way, this is actually accusing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of permitting something evil. And ta'ala Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not permit something evil. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted that we would slaughter animals, and permitted specific animals, and to say that this is cruel is actually kufr. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had permitted those, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not permit something that is unjust. Now the other part is that وَإِذَا ذَبَحْتُمْ قَتَلْتُمْ, when we're talking about qatl, whether it's humans, and when we're talking about killing a human, that would be either for a qasas or had. Al-qasas or had, the difference between al-qasas and al-had, for somebody, for example, that killed somebody. So therefore, this is a result. This is a punishment. This is a punishment for probably killing another person. And il-had is if they had committed a specific sin that is considered in Islam to be punishable by, of course, capital punishment, then that would be considered in Islam as one of those rules that are permissible in where it might cost somebody the capital punishment, and where, of course, somebody's life. So فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَةِ, whether it's a human, Muslim or not Muslim, or whether that person committed a crime or not, in the end, torture is not permissible. Torture is not permissible. And I looked at a number of different stories that were mentioned by different muhaddithin about Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, or probably different narrators that had tortured certain let's just say murtadeen, or certain people. Those were majority, in fact all of them. I have not yet come across a narration that was actually authentic, that was permissible to do, except Hadith al-Uraniyin. We'll talk about that at a different time. The other story is that the Prophet ﷺ, there was a story where a Jewish man, a young girl, a young woman, well, she's a jariyah, so a young woman, was killed by a Jewish man who actually cut her head off and smashed it with rocks. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ, based on the hadith, that they brought the head, and miraculously the Prophet ﷺ actually asked the deceased girl if it was that Jewish man that had killed her, and miraculously the head actually nodded with the eyes to say that yes, he was the one that killed me. And later there are other narrations that the Prophet ﷺ, that the man actually confessed and admit that he had killed the girl and smashed her head with the rocks, and threw her in an abandoned well. But in the end is that there are different narrations. That's number one. Different narrations whether the Prophet ﷺ just ordered for the capital punishment for that man's crime, or whether the Prophet ﷺ actually did the same that he had done to the girl. There are different narrations. To make the story short, is that a number of scholars had differences of opinions on whether, if the person had done that is a criminal, had actually done a very let's say brutal type of killing, do we do the same for that human or that person that had done that brutal way of killing, as a punishment, or do we just perform the capital punishment and that is it? The capital punishment in Islam The capital punishment in Islam is not to be done with lethal injections or, all that. It is the fastest way, easiest way, without torture whatsoever, in where it is just darbat bisayf. It is just with a sword, just to, uh, hit and bring a final death, rather than execute the person in a way that is at least presented as if it was merciful, whether that's an electric chair or a lethal injection or any of that. Because in the end is that, you can present it that was merciful, but the reality is you don't really know what it means and what that person is going to go through. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or the Prophet ﷺ, actually says فَأَحْسِنُوا الْقِتْلَ, that the main thing about Islam is that it's all about making sure that the one reduces the evil as much as possible, even if we're talking about capital punishment here. That one would make sure that even if the person deserved the death penalty, that they would still not face all that torture and all that brutality in bringing the end to the harm. So whether we're talking about humans or whether we're talking about animals, the whole thing is about making sure that you're not being brutal, and you're not being sorry about that. You're not being brutal, and you're not harming that body. So when that's why in Islam, hukm al-tamthil, generally deforming the body, generally speaking, is actually not permissible. Deforming the body, whether that was a Muslim or not Muslim, is actually not permissible. But there's a lot of details. Not all scholars. This is not agreed upon between scholars if the person had actually committed deforming, people's bodies, whether we can do it. So just saying that there are differences of opinions between scholars on that. Now, generally speaking, is that when we're talking about Zabiha, all right? So when we're talking about Zabiha, and of course, what are the things that we can do Zabiha in? Generally speaking, herbivores. So herbivores you can do Zabiha in. But the biha is more specific for, which are sheep and camels and cows, so beef basically, and so sheep and goats. All right, but those are not limited to that. So an herbivore, if it's an herbivore, you cannot eat omnivores and you cannot eat carnivores. Only herbivores. It's haram to eat. Now that's why scholars had differences of opinions on some animals that may be amphibians, such as they have differences of opinions like on animals that may be carnivores as well, like, and they're carnivores, but they're also sea animals. So things like when we're talking about alligators, are we allowed to eat alligators? Are we allowed to eat sharks, etc., even though they're carnivores? So sea animals in general, they're all halal, and you don't have to worry about dhabiha. So whether they are carnivores or whether they're herbivores, we're talking about sea animals. So sea animals in general, they're all halal, but the animals that are, herbivores and carnivores, but those are omnivores, but they're not fully sea animals. For those animals, it is actually permissible. It is permissible according to some scholars. That they would be permissible. Frogs are not halal to eat whatsoever. In fact, in Islam, it's actually haram to kill frogs. It's haram to kill frogs because of the tasbih that they do. So this is actually clear in a hadith. So I'm not sure here what cultures people that are listening come from, but just wanted to clarify that. So when we're talking about Zabiha, we're looking at what we're doing Zabiha in, and of course there are certain conditions for Zabiha. Number one is that there are certain conditions that go back on to the person that is slaughtering. The person that's slaughtering must be aqil mumayyiz. What does that mean? That the person must be mentally sound and is understanding what they're doing. And the number two condition is that they must be Muslim or from the people of the book, Jewish or Christian. All right, so they must be Muslim or one of the people of the book, and they must also not kill it for, you're actually slaughtering it for the sake of slaughter, for the sake of eating it, and not for the sake of self-defense. So you're not here attacking the animal for self-defense. Now, the other part is that you're talking about the slaughter itself. The slaughter itself, there are conditions to it as well. In where number one is that it is an herbivore, and of course, but if there's a And the other part is when we have animals such as dogs, hunting dogs, etc. Those animals, like the hunting dogs, can actually act as the one, as a substitute for the person that is slaughtering as well. Now the other part, which is that when the person is slaughtering, that we're talking about that they should not say a word of shirk. So that they are doing it in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're doing it in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're saying Bismillah Wallahu Akbar and actually slaughter. So the question is, what if they actually forget to say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar? And of course, they're working hard to strap this animal, but they're not really sure. Did I say it? Did I not say it? So what do we do then? That's it? This is the end of our sheep that we tried to slaughter. We bought it for $150, $200, and I forgot. I was just working so hard to hold the animal tight, and I was scared of the knife. This is my first time doing it, and what do I do now? So there are actually differences of opinions between scholars on if the person had forgotten. So the Hanafi, Maliki, and the Hanbali, they considered that it is obligatory. And if they forget, that it would be considered halal to eat, but they depended on the ayah, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَإِنَّهُ لَفِسْقٌ. They depended on the ayah that said, and don't eat what was not mentioned on, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name was not mentioned on, and because it is fisq, because it is transgressing the limits. Now, at the same time, they did consider that, well, the Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَجَاوَزَ لِي عَنْ أُمَّتِي الْخَطَأَ وَالنِّسْيَانَ وَمَا اسْتُكْرِهُ عَلَيْهِ. That the Prophet ﷺ actually said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven 3 things and uplifted 3 different things off the Muslim nation. Al-Khata, what they had done by mistake without the intention to actually commit that specific thing. 2, forgetfulness, and 3, something that they were coerced to do. They did not want to do it, but they were forced. They were threatened that if you don't do this, we'll kill you, we'll cut your arm off, we'll throw you off the cliff, whatever it is. Then they said, well, here's the person forgetting, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven the ummah on that. So when we're looking at that, there's also that other evidence that uh, there's actually other evidences, but we'll just go further, inshallah. So the other evidence is that they said, well, the ayah says, وَطَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ حِلٌّ لَكُمْ. The ayah says that the slaughter of طَعَامُ الَّذِينَ, and here طَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ, the food of those that are the people of the book, is halal on you. And of course, it's not speaking about cheesecake or chocolate cake here. This is talking about طَعَامُ الَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ. This is talking about the slaughter. أُوتُوا الْكِتَابَ, those that are following those that are the people of the book. حِلٌّ لَكُمْ. It is permissible unto you. And of course, they don't say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar. So if they don't say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar and it's permissible, would a Muslim slaughter not be permissible? Even though, the people of the book are not saying Bismillah Wallahu Akbar. So this is just another evidence. This is just another evidence, but you have other scholars such as Zahiriyya, they actually said that no, if they forgot to say Bismillah Wallahu Akbar, that slaughter is haram, period. And they just said, look, the ayah straightforward clearly says, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. Straightforward says that do not eat what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name was not mentioned on it. Now, there are so many different evidences, but when we're looking at the different ayat, we could see that the Prophet ﷺ in another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he himself, there was a Sahabi that also forgot, and the Prophet ﷺ said, say Bismillah and eat from it. Say Bismillah and eat from it. So in the end is that, it's a matter of differences of opinions, but generally Allahu A'lam, is that just keep that in mind, differences of opinions, and I personally regard that is the preponderant, is that you can eat if the person forgot. Just say Bismillah and eat from it. All right, let's move on. So the other part, when we're talking about Zabiha, we're actually talking about how is the Zabiha performed? How is the Zabiha performed? So number one is that the Zabiha is supposed to be actually slitting that main vein that connects between the rest of the body and the brain, and letting that knife totally cut down the throat, the throat, and of course everything that is within the main area in the front of that neck. So we're looking at not the part of it, but we're talking about the main throat. We're talking about the main vein that connects both. And of course, in that situation, one is actually there are certain adab in where one must make sure that they're actually doing ihsan fi dhabiha, that they're not being harsh on the dhabiha, where they're using a sharp tool, a sharp knife. They're saying Bismillah, and that they're qualified to do it. So it's not somebody that's scared. This is somebody's life that you're dealing with here, which is an animal life. And don't sharpen that knife in front of that animal, because they are able to know that this is their life that's going to be in danger here, and not in front of another animal, because they are able to tell that there is killing here and this is the end of life. And of course, Generally speaking, the Prophet ﷺ had actually forbid that one would torture the animals. But here's a question: what if, what if the animal was tortured? So let's say here in the U.S. or in the West, they will, with some kind of a electrocute or probably bang it on its head, hit it on its head. Will that make that dhabiha impermissible to eat or not? So that animal, if that animal did not die from that tool that hit it on its head, then later they did the dhabiha, then what they did was haram. It does not make that dhabiha haram to eat, but it makes the action haram to do, which is to torture that animal. Torturing that animal is what's haram, and not necessarily making that dhabiha haram in itself because it was beaten on the head. Generally speaking, a Muslim is supposed to be kind, even if they are going to be even if they're going to be slaughtering an animal for food. They're supposed to yurih dhabihata, let them comfort that dhabiha. Don't sit on it. Give it the chance to at least, let itself somewhat loose. Don't sit on it and put all that weight or torture the animal, but say Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permit you to eat it. So, but it doesn't give you whatsoever the right to torture the animal by feeling that you are that this animal is actually under your control. And I'm just trying to go over the notes of some things that we might have missed in. So I guess those are the most important notes about this hadith. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. There. All right, it seems like no questions. I hope I wasn't boring today. There's, the topic is pretty much very much within the structure of the biha and killing, which, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Kutiba alaykum al-qitalu wa huwa kurhun lakum. Just the issue of killing and slaughtering and all that, it's very mu'dhi lin-nafs. It's very hard on the nafs to actually even discuss. So I totally understand that people kind of got away from the class, and especially if it's women, they can't handle these topics. And I'll tell you, I mean, when we used to live on a ranch when I was a little girl, and when I saw how they were slaughtering the sheep, I couldn't sleep for days. Especially that I played with those sheep, and they were around us, and all of a sudden seeing them shake as they are being killed, it was really wrong that they would actually show me this as a young girl. But this is what they did. Well, they told me to turn my face, but I was really wondering what were they going to do and what they're going to do. So I sneaked, and I wish I never did, but I sneaked my eyes, I peeked. And I had to get a sneak peek, and I couldn't sleep for days. So I know how it feels when somebody is not comfortable with this topic. But in the end is that, subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made it halal, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had permitted that we eat this. And in the end is that when we're talking about morality and when we're talking about ethics, it's not based on what we think is good or evil, because we're human, and our limited mind, or the data that we have about the world around us, is very limited. So if you would think that it's okay to be vegan and eat only vegetable stuff, in Islam it actually considered that, and there's actually even different evidences in where even plants have feelings. So are you then going to abstain from eating plants too? And And if you're going to abstain from eating plants and eating animals, I'm not sure what you're going to eat, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created this and created this around you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. And verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that created, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most subtle and all-knowing. He knows what He had permitted for us. So when we're talking about ethics, this is really important to keep in mind. When we're talking about ethics, are we basing it on what we see as humans? Are we the center to define right and wrong? Are we the center to define brutality and good and evil? And how much do we know about the world in order to define these things? And when we go far, when we're talking about humans right now, we're seeing people actually consider that people are just matter in motion, and therefore there's no subjective morality. And then you've got other groups that will put a certain principle and say this is the principle. So what makes you the person that person that has the right to define principle? Who's going to define principle? And who are you to define principle? So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually sent al-wahy in order to teach man about himself and about the world around him, in order to define morality. Because without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we would be engaging in all these different things, which we can easily indoctrinate others and indoctrinate ourselves and call it moral and call it ethical and call it acceptable. And we're seeing that today. Allahul Musta'an. Jazakumullah khairan, everyone. Doesn't seem like anybody has any questions. Alhamdulillah, I guess it's clear. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.